Chapter 2 The War Camp. It wasn't long before the dense trees gave way to open land and they arrived at what appeared to be an ancient war camp. Xander slowed his pace as he took in the scene, his breath catching in his throat. Two wooden watchtowers loomed near the camp's entrance, with soldiers clad in sleek black uniforms standing guard, their eyes scanning the distant tree line. High above, he noticed more figures perched in the trees, keeping watch over the forest. Whatever they were waiting for, Xander suddenly felt a new unease. He was sure he didn't want to meet what was in that forest. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was tense yet alive with purpose. Soldiers moved purposefully between rows of tents, their boots kicking up dust on the well-trodden paths. Xander noticed most of them wore crystals of varying shapes and colors on a chain around their necks. The crystals caught the fading light, glinting with a faint energy that pulsed in the air. All around the camp were tents made of reinforced leather and cloth arranged in tight, orderly rows. Small fires burned in open pits, casting warm glows over groups of soldiers, sharpening weapons or talking in hushed tones. To one side, an open area held racks of weapons, spears, swords, and strange, sleek tools that hummed faintly with power. The air smelled of earth, sweat, and something sharp and metallic. If Xander hadn't been sure before that he was not on Earth anymore, now he was. This world, wherever it was unlike anything he had ever seen. As they walked further into the camp, Layla turned to Xander. "How did you get here?" she asked with a curious smile. Xander glanced around as he spoke, recounting the strange events of his day, from sparring with his student in the dojo to the inexplicable light that had pulled him into the forest. His voice wavered slightly as he described the transition, the disorienting sense of being somewhere entirely foreign. "And now, I'm here," he finished, his gaze returning to Layla. "Wherever here is." Layla mulled over his words. "No gateway, no crystal," she murmured to herself, more intrigued than alarmed. "That's interesting." Xander's thoughts turned abruptly to home. His parents, his sister, his dojo, the people who would surely notice he was missing by now. "How do I leave?" he asked, a touch of desperation in his voice as he tried to meet the princess's eyes. "I need to get back to my world." Layla's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't meet his gaze. Xander feared for the answer she was going to give him. "Not here," she said quietly, and then hastened her steps. Xander parted his lips to say more, but decided against it. He trusted her. For now. Soldiers moving through the camp began to slow, their gaze shifting toward Xander. Though none approached, their curiosity, and perhaps suspicion, was evident. Xander tried to ignore the attention, but it made his skin crawl. He was half tempted to shift into battle stance every time, expecting one of these people to attack him. He shook off the feeling and focused on the path they trod instead. Before long, they approached one of the largest tents in the camp, its entrance flanked by two guards, who stepped aside to allow them in. The interior was both simple and striking. Rich earthen rugs covered the ground, and lanterns filled with glowing crystals hung from poles, casting soft-colored lights across the space. A low table sat in the center of the room, its surface carved with intricate patterns. Behind it, cushions and mats were arranged neatly. Perhaps too fancy for a war camp, but Xander didn't voice that opinion. Layla gestured for Xander to sit on one of the mats, cross-legged before the table. As she settled, she whispered briefly to a servant who disappeared through a flap at the back of the tent. Then she took her place across from Xander. Behind her, the masters, Rel, Yin, and Lotus, stood silently. They'd all introduced themselves to Xander in their journey to the camp, and now he could feel them studying him. But that was the least of his concerns. Instead, his gaze moved to Kelzon. Kelzon leaned casually against the doorway, his eyes never leaving Xander. That one. That was who made Xander most uncomfortable. A heavy tension hung over the entire tent, but Layla somehow managed to keep her tone measured as she began. It was important she picked the right words as she addressed this stranger. "You've been through a lot. I know this must all seem impossible, but I need you to listen carefully." Xander nodded slowly, his attention fixed on her, as the glow from the lanterns reflected in her violet eyes. The path between worlds is not something we fully understand. It exists, but it's unpredictable. And even when we know of it, we don't always know where it leads. Her voice softened as she spared a glance at Kelzon before continuing. What I can tell you is this. There is one way back to your realm. One way that we know of, anyway. Xander's brow furrowed in confusion, but his interest was piqued. Layla reached up and touched a moon-white crystal hanging from a chain around her neck. Xander hadn't noticed it before, but now its faint glow caught his eye. There is a crystal, she said, fiddling with hers as she spoke, that allows travel between realms. It might even be able to take you home. If you're able to attune to it, that is. For the first time since his arrival, Xander allowed himself a small smile. Great, let me see it. Layla hesitated, her hand falling back to the table. We don't have the one you need, she admitted. You'd have to go and find it. Xander's smile disappeared. He stood abruptly. Okay, then where is it? Let's go get it, he said. He noticed the masters whisper to each other. Kelzon, who had been leaning against the doorway, let out a laugh. Oh, sure, he said, bobbing his head as if in full support of Xander's words. Just stroll right through the forest and fight off all the dark beasts while you're at it. Then he added flatly, you'd be dead in 2 hours. Xander shot him a sharp glare as he sat back down, his dislike for the man growing with each interaction. Dark beasts? He asked, raising a brow. Layla sighed. She gave Kelzon a disapproving glance but said nothing. My people have a prophecy that speaks of a savior, she began, her tone careful. One who will come to this world to help cleanse the darkness. She glanced at the masters who stood silent but watchful behind her. That darkness has managed to slip into this world and taken form here as creatures. Beasts that rise at night and attack without mercy. They killed many of our people. That's why this war camp exists. Not to prepare for battle with another kingdom, but to hold off the beast and protect our lands. The darkness spread, Xander. Perhaps even into your world. We need to cut it at its root. Xander's jaw tightened as he processed her words. He frowned slowly, then asked, And you think I'm this savior? Layla held his gaze and then nodded. Yes. One of the masters, Rel, crossed his arms and gave a small grunt. Just because the princess believes it doesn't mean we all do, he said, his tone blunt. And what of the king and queen? They'll want proof before they trust him with the weight of the prophecy. Layla sighed and looked back at Xander. You'll have to prove yourself. Xander sat in silence for a moment, unsure of how to respond. A part of him wanted to burst out laughing. Prove himself for a prophecy he'd literally just heard of? The room fell quiet until a servant entered, carrying a tray filled with food, breads, fruits, and a bowl of steaming broth. The servant placed it carefully on the table in front of Xander, and bowed before retreating silently from the tent. Layla glanced at the tray before continuing. Whether you're the savior or not, you need the crystal to find your way back. She pointed out which he reasoned with. Xander couldn't be mad at her or anyone here. It was whoever had plucked him from his dojo and dropped him here he needed to be crossed with. If you're going to search for it, you'll need to learn how to protect yourself. Xander frowned. I can protect myself. Another master, Lotus, gave a low chuckle, her silver braids catching the light of the lanterns. Not against what you'll face here, she said. Her tone was light, almost amused. There was no mistaking the seriousness behind her words. Layla stood, brushing off her dress with a sigh. You should rest, she said. We'll decide the way forward tomorrow. Without further discussion, the masters exited the tent, and Kelzon gave Xander one last smirk before following them out. Layla lingered at the entrance for a moment, her gaze meeting Xander's, as if she wanted to say more, but instead she turned and left him alone. Xander looked down at the tray of food in front of him, his stomach growling despite his conflicted thoughts. He sighed heavily, burying his face in his hands. This was all too much. The camp, the beasts, the prophecy. It all felt like some surreal dream. But the ache in his muscles and the chill of the air told him otherwise. This was real. Eventually he rose from the table, too bothered to touch any of the food, and walked to the mattress in the corner of the room. He lay down and let his body relax against the soft fabric. His mind churned with thoughts of his family, his dojo, and the strange world he found himself in. As he mulled over it, one thought became clear. He was going to find that crystal, no matter what. He would make his way back home. With that, Xander closed his eyes and drifted into an uneasy sleep.